This is an interactive video presentation. Viewers should participate by following the narrator's instructions. You're about to see a demonstration of a student writing group in which writers get a chance to experience how a real audience responds to their ideas. The best way to learn to work in groups is to see an experienced group in action. This video will show you the process. The structure is simple and consists of 3 basic steps: 2 readings and a response period. In the first step, one student reads a paper. Listen carefully without writing. Then afterwards, jot down your initial impressions of the piece.
Okay, y'all ready? Okay. Lee and I stood in the parking lot late one afternoon talking about George, a co-worker who had once again let us down by refusing to stand up for us when we needed his support. "He's afraid to hurt anyone's feelings," I said. "He means what he says when he talks to us, but when anyone challenges him, he folds." "I know," Lee groaned. "He's such a wimp." I winced. There was that word again, wimp. I don't know why I've always hated it, but every time I hear it, I cringe. And these days, it's a bad word to be sensitive about. A few years ago, most wimp callers seemed to be macho types whose idea of manhood was a kind of beery, beefy belligerence. Now everyone uses it, including males who consider themselves beyond the macho ethic, and feminists like my friend Lee. The best barometer of its pervasiveness is the way the media has adopted it. "Don't buy a wimpy bag," Tom Bosley admonishes us in one commercial. "Buy a hefty bag." In the Sunday comics, Bloom County's self-conscious penguin, Opus, tearfully confesses to his male support group that he's been accused of being a wimp, and the group reacts with horrified sympathy. Syndicated gossip columnist Susan Stewart, commenting on Prince Charles' broken finger, notes that Jack Nicholson with a bandaged hand is still a paragon of manliness, but that a Prince of Wales with a broken digit is a mere prince of wimps. Driving home after my conversation with Lee, I thought about George and wimps and wimp callers and tried to figure out why I have such an instinctive distaste for the word and why I'm always a little shocked to hear a woman use it. First of all, I realized that I sometimes like the people others call wimps. I remembered my best friend in high school, a guy who would rather paint than butt heads on a football field, a crime in a sports-obsessed small town. If the word had been around then, he would have been a wimp. Since it wasn't, he was a sissy. My friend Dennis says that he can't stand Alan Alda or Phil Donahue because they're wimps. Now, I'm not crazy about these 2 guys, but they don't seem all that bad. As I thought about the people usually accused of wimpiness, it also occurred to me that I've hardly ever heard a woman called a wimp. When was the last time you heard someone say, "Oh, that's Susan, she's such a wimp"? I'm sure it's happened, but somehow it's just not the same. Females can be airheads or dingbats or any number of other things, but they're hardly ever wimps. I was getting suspicious about the word, so I decided to visit the library and do a little research. My first stop was the Oxford English Dictionary, the historical repository of the English language. If the word wimp had had a history, it'd be there. It wasn't. The closest I came was the word wimple, a woman's headdress that can still be seen on traditionally dressed nuns. Interesting, but inconclusive. Next, I looked in Webster's Third International. Nothing. I'd about given up when I came across a scruffy little slang dictionary published in 1923. I flipped through the yellow pages, and there it was. Wimp, a, in parentheses, young, woman, a girl, circa 1920. Suspicions confirmed. But it shouldn't be surprising. Accusing a male of having so-called feminine traits is a time-honored insult. I remember my parents warning my little brother to stop crying because he was acting like a girl. My high school friend, the one who painted instead of playing football, was called a sissy, a variation of sister. Males who don't act manly enough are also pussies, which can mean cat-like, but in this case probably doesn't. It also occurred to me that Alan Alda and Phil Donahue, the wimps of TV, according to Dennis, are 2 men who proclaim their feminist sympathies publicly. It's no wonder that women are seldom called wimps. Why accuse a female of being like a girl or a woman? It made sense that it bothered me to hear people I admired, particularly women, using that word. But the interesting thing about the whole subject is not that wimp means woman. The interesting thing is that we're so oblivious to the implications of the language we use. A lot of the people who use wimp these days would never dream of sneering to someone, "You're acting like a woman." But these same people have no qualms at all about accusing someone of wimping out. The word's origins are obscure enough that it hasn't come under the same scrutiny as more obvious examples of sexist language. And most people who are aware that language reflects our perceptions don't think about the way language shapes our perceptions, especially when the connotations of the language are not explicit. What does this all mean? Well, it doesn't mean that the word will no longer be heard. It's entrenched, and there are still plenty of people who would find it a perfectly good word, even if they knew its origins. But for me, it means that my intuitions were right, and I have a good reason to cringe when I hear it. I agree with Lee that our mutual acquaintance George is many things: spineless, indecisive, even cowardly. But as far as I'm concerned, he'll never be a wimp.
At this point, take about 30 seconds to write down your first impressions. Now the writer will read the piece again. While she's reading, write continuously. Get down as many specific responses as you can about what in the piece works for you and what doesn't work for you, and any suggestions you might give the writer.
Okay, second time. Lee and I stood in the parking lot late one afternoon talking about George, a co-worker who had once again let us down by refusing to stand up for us when we needed his support. He's afraid to hurt anyone's feelings, I said. He means what he says when he talks to us, but when anyone challenges him, he folds. I know, Lee groaned. He's such a wimp. I winced. There was that word again, wimp. I don't know why I've always hated it, but every time I hear it, I cringe. And these days, it's a bad word to be sensitive about. A few years ago, most wimp callers seemed to be macho types whose idea of manhood was a kind of beery, beefy belligerence. Now everyone uses it, including males who consider themselves beyond the macho ethic, and feminists like my friend Lee. But the best barometer of its pervasiveness is the way the media has adopted it. Don't buy a wimpy bag, Tom Bosley admonishes us in one commercial. Buy a hefty bag. In the Sunday comics, Bloom County's self-conscious penguin Opus tearfully confesses to his male support group that he's been accused of being a wimp, and the group reacts with horrified sympathy. Syndicated gossip columnist Susan Stewart, commenting on Prince Charles's broken finger, notes that Jack Nicholson with a bandaged hand is still a paragon of manliness, but that a Prince of Wales with a broken digit is a mere prince of wimps. Driving home after my conversation with Lee, I thought about George and wimps and wimp callers and tried to figure out why I have such an instinctive distaste for the word, and why I'm always a little shocked to hear a woman use it. First of all, I realized that sometimes I like the people others call wimps. I remembered my best friend in high school, a guy who would rather paint than butt heads on a football field, a crime in a sports-obsessed small town. If the word had been around then, he would have been a wimp. Since it wasn't, he was a sissy. My friend Dennis says he can't stand Alan Alda or Phil Donahue because they're wimps. Now, I'm not crazy about these two guys, but they don't seem all that bad. As I thought about the people usually accused of wimpiness, it also occurred to me that I've hardly ever heard a woman called a wimp. When was the last time you heard someone say, "Oh, that's Susan, she's such a wimp"? I'm sure it's happened, but somehow it's just not the same thing. Females can be airheads, or dingbats, or any number of other things, but they're hardly ever wimps. I was getting suspicious about that word, so I decided to visit the library and do a little research. My first stop was the Oxford English Dictionary, the historical repository of the English language. If the word wimp had a history, it'd be there. It wasn't. The closest I came was the word wimple, a woman's headdress that can still be seen on traditionally dressed nuns. Interesting, but inconclusive. Next, I looked in Webster's Third International. Nothing. I'd about given up when I came across a scruffy little slang dictionary published in 1923. I flipped through the yellow pages, and there it was. Wimp, a, in parentheses, young, woman, a girl, circa 1920. Suspicions confirmed, but it shouldn't be surprising. Accusing a male of having so-called feminine traits is a time-honored insult. I remember my parents warning my little brother to stop crying because he was acting like a girl. My high school friend, the one who painted instead of playing football, was called a sissy, a variation of sister. Males who don't act manly enough are also pussies, which can mean cat-like, but in this case probably doesn't. It also occurred to me that Alan Alda and Phil Donahue, the wimps of TV, according to Dennis, are two men who proclaim their feminist sympathies publicly. It's no wonder that women are seldom called wimps. Why accuse a female of being like a girl or a woman? It made sense that it bothered me to hear people I admired, particularly women, using that word. But the interesting thing about the whole subject is not that the wimp means woman. The interesting thing is that we're so oblivious to the implications of the language we use. A lot of the people who use wimp these days would never dream of sneering to someone, "You're acting like a woman." But these same people have no qualms at all about accusing someone of wimping out. The word's origins are obscure enough that it hasn't come under the same scrutiny as more obvious examples of sexist language. And most people who are aware that language reflects our perceptions don't think about the way language shapes our perceptions, especially when the connotations of the language are not explicit. What does this all mean? Well, it doesn't mean that the word will no longer be heard. It's entrenched, and there are still plenty of people who would find it a perfectly good word, even if they knew its origins. But for me, it means that my intuitions were right, and I have good reason to cringe when I hear it. I agree with Lee that our mutual acquaintance George is many things: spineless, indecisive, even cowardly. But as far as I'm concerned, he'll never be a wimp.
Now the reader will listen and take notes for revision as group members give their responses.
Okay. My first impressions were that I really liked the use of the examples like Alan Alda and Phil Donahue, though I didn't remember him in the first reading. And I think the whole essay talks pretty well about the origins of wimpdom. I wasn't too sure exactly what a wimp is after the essay was over, but I liked the way that there was sort of a reversal in the definition, that there was this sexual reversal that sort of bore out the origins or the way that we look at wimps, I guess. Specifically, I liked where it started with Lee and I in the parking lot. I thought that was real good. There was something about letting us down and refusing to stand up for us that I just didn't like, I guess. Folds? Yeah, folds. He always folds. That was a good expression. And then your wincing and cringing was nice. I didn't like the beery, beefy belligerence, but that sounded real kind of, I don't know, composed or something.
Mm-hmm.
I was a little confused about the use of Lee as a feminist, and I think that maybe makes sense later on, but at that point it seemed kind of shocking to me. Tom Bosley in the Hefty Bag, that was great. Prince Charles as opposed to Jack Nicholas was really good. I liked that word paragon of whatever. And Prince Charles, the Prince of Wimps, was really nice. The crime in a sports-obsessed city, I thought maybe was a little overdone. I had a question at one point too. The Bloom County opus reference to the Penguin. If someone hadn't read that, it was sort of like a lost reference to. It was for me, because I can sort of recall it vaguely, but not very well. The point about liking wimps, I thought was really good, because that's sort of a turn in the paper. It felt like it anyway. And the connection between Sissy, I liked the way he came back to Alan Alda and Phil Donahue.
Mm-hmm.
There's some point, you said some point, not the same thing as, and I don't know why I put that in the negative column, but I did. No women wimps, I thought was really good, because that's where the sexual sort of perspective came in that I thought was real nice. Visiting the library, using the OED, something about the historical repository that I didn't like. I just thought that was sort of, you didn't need it or something. The definition from Wimple, though, was great and interesting but inconclusive. I liked the tone in that. About the wimp from the slang dictionary, the wimp being a young girl, was very good. And then you went immediately to this thing of time-honored insult. Something about that phrase I didn't particularly care for. I don't know why. It seemed to, again, kind of overdone or something. Sissy, a variation of sister, I liked a lot. And the thing about pussy was great. Connotations, I don't know what I didn't like about connotations, but I put it twice in the negative column. It seems sort of too formal or something. The female girl or a woman, why did I put that there? I don't know. Can't remember what that particular thing was. Anyways, sneer, acting like at people acting like a woman. I thought that was good. Wimping out, great phrase. I like the point about language shaping our perceptions, but again, that was the negative column. I put connotations not being explicit. It sounded sort of too analytical to me for some reason. Spineless and indecisive George, even cowardly, but he'll never be a wimp. And then at the end, I came back to the question that I had in the first impressions. But what is a wimp? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I also liked the opening dialogue. I thought it focused very nicely and generally upon the whole notion of wimp. In fact, the whole structure of the paper I thought works really well. Generally focusing upon wimp, and then it focuses a little bit on a stipulative definition of wimp, and then focuses on how women are a reflection of wimp, or wimp is a reflection of women, and then broadens out to research, and then makes the point about language and how it reflects perceptions. I think that works very well. The idea of beery and beefy seems a bit stereotypical to me, in a reverse way. It seems to work against precisely what you're working for.
Okay.
I think you lose track of the feminist issue too soon. It's clear that it's an argument, and it's as if you're walking around it in order not to assault anyone's sensibilities. Let me see. Oh, after the research starts, there's lots of definitions, stipulative definitions of what wimp is. After the research starts and you go to the slang dictionary, again, there's more definitions. And like Michael, I found myself asking, well, okay, what is a wimp then? It's as if you think the definitions will make the case. And I don't think it does. The rhetorical question, though, is great. What does this all mean? I think that brings everything back into focus. And when you say the intuition is right, your intuition is right, it again raises the question, what is it? And I think there needs to be more explanation there. It needs to be more explicit. George will never be a woman, but surely you're saying more than that. I mean, George obviously never will be a woman. And I think more needs to be said about the fact that as I hear it, the argument that this is a left-handed insult, you know, there's a sexism entrenched even in our slang, in our insults. That needs to be brought up.
Thanks.
Okay. I have some of the same comments, some different ones. I liked the paper overall. It moved a little slowly for me at the beginning. It took me a long time to really decide, is this a significant topic? By the end, I'm convinced it is, but I wondered if there was a way to dramatize more directly at the beginning how language shapes perception. I wasn't sure that the example at the beginning served that purpose. On the second reading, I went back through and made a lot more specific responses. I had a question mark right off whether the opening scene dramatized the problem enough that I think you're trying to get across in the paper. I like a lot of the expressions you use that sort of focus the piece for me. At the end of that scene when you say there was that word again, I'm sort of right at home and I get a sense of where this is going. I kind of like the beery, beefy belligerence, but you know, that's the poet in me or something. I like all that alliteration. I thought the examples were wonderful. The wimpy, hefty bag, Opus, Prince of Wimps. I think right off you're giving people a sense of how much there is in our culture that reflects that sort of the attitudes toward men and women, you know, whatever that term means. At the point where you're driving home thinking about the word, for some reason that felt a little too contrived for me. And what I felt was that, okay, now I'm going to learn the lesson of the piece, and I wondered if there was a way to make that a little bit more subtle. I like the expression interesting but inconclusive, just the kind of dry irony there of going to the dictionary, because as usual the dictionary doesn't always tell us very much. And so the humor there is real nice. I did have a question when you said that women don't call each other wimps. I'm sort of embarrassed to admit, but I call myself a wimp, and I've heard other women call them each other wimps. Now, by the end of this paper, I start questioning that, which is good, but I'd have to challenge that. I think that women do call each other wimps, and maybe that's, it fits right in with the serious issue, which is what does it mean when a woman calls herself that? I put down something on where you're talking about accusing a male of having feminine traits. Oh, I like that, especially the way you followed up with examples right off. By that point in the paper, I realized how serious the topic is. And I'm no longer thinking, well, is this just sort of an anecdotal piece. I was glad you used the word pussy, that you had the nerve to put it in. And I also thought maybe you'd even consider the watered-down version wussy, because it's sort of interesting the way people euphemize those things. The real focus of the paper is language shapes our perceptions, which I think is a really important idea. It is very abstract, though, and I wondered if you could find an example other than the opening scene that helps dramatize to what degree it shapes our perceptions. And I almost thought a way into that is talking about maybe a time, maybe you never did use the term, but if you ever used the word term wimp yourself, how it made you feel, how it made you feel about yourself as a woman, or how it sort of suggests a sense of inferiority that a lot of women have in this culture. I did like the way the essay was set up. Coming back to George is a real nice framing device. I get a sense of closure. So the essay feels finished to me at that point. So it works real well.
Great, thanks.
After group members finish their responses, it's time for another group member to read, and the process is repeated until everyone has read. Now we'll open up the process to questions students have about using writing groups.
How does it feel to have all these people making comments about your writing? Isn't it kind of scary?
Well, yeah, the first time I did it, it was real scary. But then I got so much feedback, and it was the first time that I'd ever been able to look at my work through somebody else's eyes, and so I got real interested in it. And now, I mean, well, I'm kind of a ham about it. I love doing this. It's real fun. And so no, it went away after a while. In the beginning.
Yes, Erica, I was wondering, you didn't say much while they were responding to your essay, and I was wondering why, actually.
Yeah, isn't it hard to keep quiet?
Yeah, this is your baby. And they're taking it apart. And it's real tough, but you have to. If you start responding, you get sidetracked, and the whole thing goes away, and you find that you're defending a paper that doesn't actually exist. If I got this published, I couldn't follow it around, and every time someone read it, I couldn't say, oh, no, wait, I meant this. It's got to go out on its own. And so I have to sit there and listen to what they heard. And that works. It works after a while. But for a while, I felt like I had to sit on my hands or cover my mouth or something, because it was really tough not to.
Yeah, along those lines, to the critics, writing is such a personal thing. How do you make comments without hurting somebody's feelings, or you're even concerned about that when you're making your comments?
I worry about it. I think the first thing you want to do is to stress the positive. I think most of us grew up with what I'd call a Reading mentality, which is, well, to critique something is to just rip it apart. And I think you have to forget about that and make sure that you're getting things down in the plus column, and making sure that you're finding something that you like in the piece, which doesn't mean you have to lie about the paper or not say anything negative, but to find good things to say. The other thing I think you have to do is separate the writer from the piece of writing. It's important to say something like, the paper made me feel like this at this point. Now, that's not saying you make me feel like this, but if you can work out an understanding with your group that, in fact, the focus is on the writing and whether it's working or not, and not to let the sort of personal business come into play, I think it's pretty effective.
I think another thing, too, is that when you're commenting, at least when I'm commenting, I try not to tell people what to do or tell them what I think they should do. with the paper. I try to respond more or less to what I hear and what I like or what I didn't like or what I thought just didn't work or didn't fit with the tone of the paper. The advantage to that, just as someone who's reading too, is that it sort of always makes you remember that it's your writing and you can do with it what you want when you're done. And it's a nice kind of alternative to what you get from teachers, because they'll always sort of write what's wrong here. You don't necessarily get prescriptive comments at all unless you just, people say this worked or I didn't understand this. And I think it helps.
Everybody has so much to say. Isn't it hard to write all that down when you have to write and listen at the same time?
Well, I think we're all experienced in this group, and so the responses that we got come from being experienced with writing groups. I have to admit, excuse me, I have to admit the first couple times that I was involved in this, I got maybe 1, 2, 3 comments. But like anything, it's a skill, and it gets easier with practice.
It also helps to follow a strict format to help you sort of remember the whole procedure. So what I usually do is I'll write a quick paragraph just summarizing my general impressions, and then I draw columns like this, where I've got one column that has a plus mark over it and one column that has a minus mark and one column that has a question mark. And basically, as the second reading goes through, if I have a kind of negative response, like something didn't sound right, I'll try to remember the key words in that sentence and I'll put it down under the negative column. Or if I hear something, oh, I really like that, like the beery belligerence or whatever that I happen to like, I put that in the plus column. And something that just didn't sound right, sounds a little awkward, or I want to come back to, I'll stick it in the question mark column. And just getting those key words down helps trigger my memory when it comes to talking about the piece. Why did I stop at that part? What was my response? And that helps sort of focus your whole reaction.
Well, they all say so much. How do you decide what to use?
Well, I don't know if you noticed, I was taking notes the whole time that they were responding, and that I found is real important. When I wasn't taking notes, my tendency would be only to remember the negative things that anybody said, because that's what we're trained to listen for. And so I write down everything, and I make notes on the paper, I make general notes on a different sheet of paper, and then I take them home, and after I've cooled down and I'm really able to listen, then I can look at what they've said and work through it, and see what they're saying to me. Otherwise, I think I would lose about 80% of what they say, because I'm still so much the reader. I can't listen yet.
Erica, obviously there's differences between the way people respond to what you say. Like, for instance, some of them liked the beery, beefy belligerence and others didn't. So how do you respond to those conflicting things?
Well, in the end, it's my paper, and I can't send it out and say, this is my paper, but it's really, I kept this in because Chris liked it. That won't work. And I think with that, I think the beery beefy one's a real good example. 2 people didn't like it, 1 person did. When I read it, I didn't like it. When I heard it out loud, I thought, no, that's pushing. That's a little too hard. I hear that a lot when I read my work out loud to other people. So in the end, I make the decision. And in this case, it happens to be a decision that 2 out of the 3 people agreed with. Sometimes I'll make a decision and decide to cut something that everybody else likes. But in the end, I'm responsible for it, so I make the decision.
Why is it that there's such a formality? Why not just sit around and talk things over? Just talk about it without all the rules.
Well, I think the main concern is time. If you just sit around and talk about the paper, you end up with a lot of table talk, and it takes a lot of time. And if you've got a lot of time, that's fine, but usually in a situation like this, you don't. Also, with too much table talk, it has a tendency to cut people who aren't as, maybe as aggressive or aren't as articulate. It gives them a chance to not talk. And so people who talk a lot end up monopolizing, and people who don't talk end up getting shut out. Also, the idea of a structure. There's a structure that helps you keep the business of the paper itself, and it helps you stay focused. So the rules help you stay focused on the paper itself, not on the responses.
I guess what I'd like to know is, why are you doing this? What do you expect to gain from it, and what could I expect to gain from it?
Okay, oddly enough, it makes me a better reader of my own writing. Like when I started this and I tried to listen, which I was not very used to doing, I thought, oh, how will I ever, catch all this, or how will I hear enough? And the more practice I got, after several weeks, I became very good at picking up nuances in language. And I didn't expect it to translate into my own writing, but it did. When I sat down to write something myself, I could hear what the language sounded like, and I was much more apt to be able to figure out what the potential problems might be as I did my own writing. And that was a benefit I didn't expect.
I'd like to elaborate just a little bit on Chris's points. It does help me improve different skills. For example, I think I've become a better listener, and it helps in a lot of areas. It also helps me improve articulating my ideas so that I can not only talk about my ideas, I can talk about writing.
Just to add both really to what they were saying too, I think the thing that I like most about the writers groups is that when it's my turn, I'm starting to be able to feel good about the initial impression that my writing will make on an audience that isn't necessarily composed just of teachers. And that's really the real world audience in the end anyway. That kind of feedback on a very immediate level, and then also the more specific things that they might choose that I thought were going to work and didn't, or in fact that I didn't realize worked and did for the other readers and the other respondents, really helps me out. And I think it gives you a sense that your writing can work out there in the real world, because people are a little less, they're not less judgmental, it's just that they're less prescriptive about what they're saying to you. So that feels good.
Yeah, and these folks sort of become they're my support group before I send it out in the real world. They're the people that are helping me in a safe environment figure out what isn't getting across to an audience. As soon as I made the switch in my mind that what was important was not the particular words I'd written this time, but the idea I was trying to get across, I'm real committed to this idea, and I wanted to work it through, and they're helping me work it through. And so it made a switch between, this is mine, I'm protecting it, don't you change a word of this, to, okay, he didn't get that idea. If I want someone else to get that idea, I have to make it clear. And so rather than being an antagonist, they're all being support groups. And so for me, that's why it works. Works real well.